Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. As Elvira mentioned, 60 years ago, a rabbi was invited to address the American Medical Association, and he was asked to speak on the topic of the patient as a person. He accepted that invitation, but as soon as he showed up, in his opening words, he proposed that that theme would be extended at future occasions in order to consider and take up the topic of the person as a patient. So tonight, that's what we're going to do. We're going to take up Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's suggestion and consider the extent to which coming to understand and see ourselves as patients gives each of us deeper meaning and insight into what it means to be human. Now, he proposed this topic, the person as a patient, because he really contended that there is a sense in which we're all patients. He said, scratch the skin of any human being, and you come upon some degree of helplessness, misery, or even agony. But of course, it's the literal experience of actually being a medical patient that can be a help to discovering for oneself this patient dimension of our lives, this patient structure even to human existence. And I certainly found that to be the case personally. The words of Heschel and of his beautiful address that we love so much became really concrete and practical to me in ways that have surprised and forged me, and that I'm going to trace for all of you. Like most kids growing up in Canada, I remember learning the Terry Fox story every year in school. For the non-Canadians in the room, this is the story of a man who had cancer, he had a prosthetic leg, and he decided to run across Canada to raise money for cancer research. And he really looms large in the Canadian imagination. To date, more than $850 million has been raised for cancer research, and every year, kids learn the Terry Fox story. We do the Terry Fox run, and I remember doing this run as a kid, as all of the Canadians here probably do as well, and I remember that I ran differently than I ran when I was playing soccer or tag, because this was a run that actually meant something. I felt like it was decisive for something. And each year, watching that documentary of his story, I thought, even as a little kid, that if I ever got cancer, I would want to run the race of that diagnosis, even if metaphorically, something like Terry did. And I think this is significant because really, when we think about it, the Terry Fox story is the context in which most Canadians learn about cancer for the first time. So I think it's significant that it's the story of his heroic marathon of hope. So growing up, I was certainly more attached to the Terry Fox story than I was to my own family's history of cancer. But gradually, step by step, I started to have the sense that this all concerned me personally. And given the prevalence of hereditary cancer in my family, I was right about that. In my family, there's a really strong predisposition to breast and ovarian cancer due to BRCA, or BRCA, and my grandmother got breast cancer at age 30. My great-grandmother got breast cancer at age 30. My grandmother died of ovarian cancer at 39. My aunt nearly died of ovarian cancer at 37. So when my mom tested positive for BRCA, she decided in her early 30s to have a preventive mastectomy and oophorectomy. And later, when I was a teenager, she actually published a book about her experiences, and she told me that she wrote that book mainly for me. It was called Am I Next in Line? So this genetic mutation is why my maternal grandmother, from whom I received my Jewish identity, is the only grandparent who I never met. And this predisposition is partly why my mother couldn't have as many children as she had hoped to. But it's also why I developed personally a passion for life issues, for the dignity of the human person, and this sense of responsibility. So it's interesting that this genetic risk is actually part of a lifelong experience of family, genealogy, ancestry, faith, bioethics, belonging, meaning. It's pretty all-encompassing. And it's been this thread of continuity throughout my life through which I've discovered a sort of paradox, that it's the same thing that threatens generations that also, in a certain sense, binds us. So once I became an adult and was then old enough to go for genetic testing, I did, and I confirmed my own extremely high risk for these particular cancers. Well, a few years later, when I was 25, then I went and I had a meeting with a genetic counselor. It was in Toronto, where I had been living at the time, and it was a really brief appointment, but I remember clearly what she said to me. She said, when I was 25, "Our strong recommendation is that you have a mastectomy at age 30 and an oophorectomy when your family is complete or by age 35, whatever is first. You can always do IVF and screen out the BRCA embryos." That was my first ever experience of counseling. And it jolted me, of course, to receive advice that, were my own mom to have taken, would have resulted in me being selectively discarded. I can now see why one of Canada's leading disability rights activists and scholars, Catherine Frazee, told a seminar of genetic counseling students, disability activists would go further, even in claiming that the very process of prenatal counseling presupposes an implicit bias against carrying to term any fetus having genetic predispositions to disability. So since she had been born shortly after the invention of amniocentesis, she called herself a fugitive from the laws of genetic science. And this resonates when I reflect on the fact that I was born just before the discovery of the BRCA genes. So I started looking into these BRCA forums online, where people are crowdsourcing bioethical reflection. It's quite interesting. And I was surprised to read notes from so many mothers grappling with what I guess we could call a sense of genetic guilt. In the groups, I saw things like this post that said, "Does anyone else feel guilt? I think about my kids testing positive for BRCA, and then my grandchildren, and I literally cry my eyes out. I know I didn't necessarily give it to them, but I can't get the thought out of my head." Or, "I haven't quite handled the guilt of knowing my 3 kids now have to be tested." Or, "I know it's not something I can control, but I still feel so much guilt." Or, "The only thing I got from my genetic counselor was guilt for choosing to have kids. And my fertility doctor really pushed me to go the IVF route to avoid passing the BRCA mutation to my baby." So I was also struck, though, on the variations of the theme of what one woman, a BRCA carrier, expressed in her comment beneath one of these threads. She just wrote simply, "I never wish I wasn't born." And I thought, yeah, that's it exactly. Don't pity my existence, my life is awesome. Of course, there are ways in which genetic testing and genetic knowledge can be in real service to the person. But this demands reflection on whether we're making use of technology and stewarding scientific knowledge in a way that actually supports and yields to the person, or in a way that violates or in some sense undermines them. There's all the difference between seeking to improve a child's health versus wanting to accept only healthy children. So despite all of these issues with genetic testing and counseling, I did determine, though, that preventive surgery would be in my interest in this case. And that's when I realized I would really need to seek out doctors who I could trust, given this fraught ethical terrain. And thankfully, I was able to find an excellent family doctor who became an amazing advocate for me who I could trust, not only in regard to my physical health, but also to cooperate with me in affirming certain ethical values. He became this kind of anchor for me in a constellation of so many other well-meaning professionals who well-intentioned, don't necessarily share our sense of what it is to be human. Then, when I was 29, I had another required call with a different genetic counselor after I had decided to proceed with a preventive mastectomy. And the epiphany during that particular appointment came when she told me that there are better and worse reconstructive surgeons, and that the good ones are usually booked because they're good. So get on it. When she told me about the one who she considered to be the best, she didn't just talk about the proficiency of his skill, but she really conveyed something of his character to me. And it was those kinds of details, brief as they were, that made me feel the most hopeful about him. So I was eagerly awaiting the referral, and I remember that the email came on a Friday night, just after I'd finished having dinner with a friend on a patio. I remember saying goodbye, biking a few blocks away, getting off my bike, and then feverishly right there on the street corner, Googling this surgeon. I must have read everything he's ever tweeted, and I was able to even find a documentary, a full documentary that gave me a sense of his philosophy of care. First, I was struck by how he compared surgery to painting and sculpture rather than to plumbing and mechanics. Now, this surgeon happens to have a background in fine arts, and he actually continues to paint, which he considers an ongoing training and observation. And he says that he thinks the world of scientific research would benefit from such artistic education. Through the surgeon's YouTube videos, and even from his gallery exhibit that I found online, I could see that he had thought clearly about the meaning of terms and the surgeries that he does in his attempt to contribute to a person's sense of normality and wholeness. Through the video, I also heard him speak about how he had explained his surgical work to his children, and he said things like, he spoke with a lot of humility. He said things like, in surgery, you need confidence to do what you're doing, but the best surgeons that I know don't have that godlike character or ego. And helping the patient out when they're in trouble, it's a great privilege to be involved in someone's life like that. So I think it's because I was recognizing and sensing how much this surgery was affecting me in my totality, that it actually opened me up to consider and be cognizant that each physician, too, has an inner moral life and a range of personal relationships, responsibilities, and commitments. So for that reason, the more that I could find out about him, the more it increased my trust. It mattered that I found someone who would treat me like a person, and more specifically, like the person I am. Of course, it wasn't that important for him to know that much about me, but it was really important to me that he had a sense that this was not just a medical intervention, but a life intervention. And to my mind, this surgery was something that we were doing together. And so I really wanted to do it well. And I felt a great sense of responsibility to be a good and cooperative patient. From my perspective, our encounter was as dramatic and as capable of nobility as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel put it when he said, "The doctor enters a covenant with his patient. He penetrates his life, affecting his mode of living, often deciding his fate. The doctor's role is one of royal authority, while the patient's mood is one of anxiety and helplessness. The patient is literally a sufferer, while the doctor is the incarnation of his hope." Now, perhaps the constraints and demands under which you work don't always make it feel like you're the incarnation of your patient's hope, but that's often true anyway. I think back and I recall that the greatest anxiety that I had throughout this whole experience was not the day of the surgery, because this was during the pandemic and almost everything had been canceled, and I was just impressed that the surgery was something that was actually allowed to happen. But my greatest nervousness came before the consultation, when I was preparing to meet some residents, the 2 surgeons, a couple nurses, and some administrative staff. That's because, to me, it felt like an audition during which I had to humanize myself a little before each of them. I had only this one appointment a month before the surgery to become a person in their eyes. And I had to do it pretty much entirely with words, since we were all wearing masks. So each time a different man came in to examine my breasts, without being able to read any of the anxiety on my face, I was thinking of what philosopher Emmanuel Levinas says about the face and the importance of seeing it, when he says, "But the relationship with the face is immediately ethical in nature. The face is what you cannot kill, or at least in the sense that says, 'Thou shalt not kill.'" If our faces tell stories, I was thinking, then what is the effect on this encounter of not being able to see them? The plastic surgeon who had come so highly recommended put me at ease the most when he took the time to ask just a few questions about my studies and work, so briefly. I told him that I had studied the life and thought of John Paul II in Poland, and that I had been working in politics. So the morning of the surgery, a month later, he came into the room to greet me, and he said, "I recall that you studied in Poland." That was the most reassuring sentence I had of the entire day, because to me that signified that I had become a subject to him, not merely an object of the treatment. So the thing is, those moments of apparent small talk, because of the context in which they occur, are way more consequential than they seem. They're going to be justifiably forgotten by the medical team, but they will be remembered by the patient as constitutive of some defining experience of hers, of how she remembers and now tells that story for the rest of her life. So the way that you accompany patients in those moments of particular vulnerability can be decisive for what they glean from the experience, and your everyday way of relating to patients is going to reverberate throughout lives and relationships, even after that person is no longer your patient. And what people have to say about their experiences of care also brings to bear on how we as a culture contend with being human. And for this reason, your words and gestures and movements are significant, even if they seem quite ordinary and routine. This is because, as Rabbi Heschel put it, character is shaped by experiences of quality, particularly by what we come upon in times of anxiety. And few experiences make such a decisive impact upon our ability to understand the meaning of being human as the way in which the doctor relates himself to us at such times. My experience as a patient also reinforced my conviction that medical care cannot be detached from the ethical good and from the truth about the human person. Accordingly, I think doctors and patients have this ongoing responsibility to form ourselves, morally, as you're doing by choosing to spend time here this weekend. Medicine is also a realm where we are seeing the same skills being applied to different ends. So it is a question of ethics. Who is the human person who you are trying to heal? Because no amount of etiquette or niceties can substitute from that real attention to the person's good. And precisely because of the high esteem in which I hold the surgeons and the rest of the team who contributed to my life-saving care, I'm disconcerted and unsettled when I hear about them sometimes treating others using the same skills in ways that we could consider harmful or that we know are harmful. And I found that it's also healing to be able to trust the person to whom I'm entrusting myself. Your ethical commitments matter, and they will be found out. My body is not just something that I have, it is who I am. So if you've done something to my body, it has been done to me. And so I want to say a brief word about euphemisms. I find we can do damage to reality when we use them, and ways that make it harder for the patient to actually accept his or her situation. We can see this is definitely the case with things like euthanasia and the euphemisms surrounding it. But even in my case, since my own tissue could not be used, my breasts were not reconstructed. And there was a point at which a well-intentioned hospital social worker with whom I was having some sessions tried to coach me into accepting and kind of affirming this idea, I have new breasts. She gave it to me as like a writing prompt. But it wasn't true. Eventually I took out a piece of paper and I wrote down, I just have implants. I have implants inside me, I don't have breasts anymore. I have trademarked implants made of medical grade silicone gel that make it look like I have breasts. Writing that sentence felt like a breakthrough. And the more I thought about that matter-of-factly, the less surprised and discordant I felt, and the better adjusted and more comfortable I became. And the social worker was like, my job is done, in a rather dismissive, derisive way. But it was helpful, because what she had suggested was not true. So if in a few years I need to have the oophorectomy, it matters to me that the person who would do it also has a reverence toward fertility and toward maternity. You have to kind of get what's at stake. And it matters to me that they understand that such a surgery can be a source both of resigned relief and of grief. And above all, they think about what they are doing in the life of a woman. It's also important for me to find doctors who have a reverence before the mystery of human vulnerability, with a confidence to recognize the limits. The person is no less valuable when their issues cannot be cured or treated, as many of you affirm so excellently throughout your practice every day. Not all issues can be solved, as we know, but the deepest treatment and cure lies in the humanization and the personalization, in the reverence and care we show toward one another that is really the source of meaning and value in our lives. Sometimes the most healing thing that you can do is abide our difficulty with us. You can say things like, this may not be successful, but you can take confidence in knowing that you did everything you could to be as proactive, as open-hearted, as responsible, as generous, whatever the case may be, whatever's true. Suffering does not always have a solution, but it can always have an answer in the form of someone who says or who shows with more than words, I am with you. I remember when I was in high school listening to a talk about vocation, and the speaker had described vocation as being where your passion intersects with the needs of the world. And I thought, okay, got it. My passion, my aptitudes, my interests, what I'm good at, what comes easily, what comes naturally. But gradually I came to think about how passion is really connected to and means most deeply suffering. And that changes the discernment. I think probably for the best. So what difference does it make, you could ask yourself, to consider my vocation as being where my suffering, where my particular suffering intersects with the needs of the world? How does all that I have had to undergo become the basis for everything that I now have to give? Such questions can make us attentive to certain avenues that we're called to navigate and explore as we discover the basis for the unique contributions that we are meant to make and that we are able to make. Not very many people know that the experiences that I'm sharing with you tonight are what contribute to my deep sensitivity to mortality, to my concerns about eugenics and euthanasia, and to my devotion to protecting and defending human life. I have no conceits about longevity, and this gives me a sense of urgency to do good. I have felt the sting of the suggestion that life with a known vulnerability is less worth living, and I have rejected that assessment of the value of my life. All of these facts of my existence are tremendously decisive, and I thank God for giving me these circumstances, because now I can see the way in which they have made me, that the way in which these circumstances are actually maximally conducive to my particular flourishing and to my gift of self. And painful as they often are, I would not wish for otherwise, because I have come to see the ways that these experiences make my life deeper and richer, more capable of savoring, and filled with this burst of urgency and immediacy that comes from tasting and sensing the shortness of this life. That makes me think also of one of my favorite philosophers, Dietrich von Hildebrand, a German philosopher who, in his anti-Nazi activism, had to flee Europe and become a refugee in America. Years later, his wife asked him if it was hard for him to have grown up in beautiful and noble houses, only to become dependent on others and live in slummy apartments. His wife recounts that Dietrich looked at her in astonishment when she asked him this, and said to her, there is nothing for which he would have traded the joy of receiving such remarkable charity and loving concern as he found from the people he met in America. I think that's the height of a patient experience, is to leave a healthcare interaction, even a very arduous one, with the conviction that I would not have wanted to miss this because of the quality of care and the depth of human compassion that I found here. And to be a patient is to know from the inside how important that is. Of course, though, it can be pretty hard for doctors and nurses to become patients themselves. I think it can be hard in a way that it was hard for Beethoven to become deaf. When Beethoven was going deaf in his late 20s and 30s, this caused him such tremendous sorrow to the extent that he even contemplated suicide. In a letter that he wrote, and that was private until his death decades later, he said, how could I possibly admit an infirmity in the one sense which ought to be more perfect in me than in others, a sense which I once possessed in the highest perfection, a perfection such as few in my profession enjoy or ever have enjoyed. Beethoven was surprised that he, of all people, could suffer deafness. It seemed like a cosmic joke that could have led him to despair. So perhaps there's this analogous way in which those whose vocation consists in healing and skill and technical prowess can feel almost like they've been pranked if and when they become patients themselves. Yet, the greatness of the works that Beethoven composed, because many of his works were composed later, rendered something of which he was uniquely capable because of what he had endured. His skill became intensified, not diminished, when he inevitably experienced this poverty and lack in the most important dimension of his life and profession. So the personal experiences that we each have of suffering, whatever they may be and whatever form they might take, are what enable our capacity to become a shelter for the wounds of others. But where and how do we become a shelter for the woundedness of others, but in our very own wounds? And I love how Carol Houselander, this writer, defines compassion as a communion in suffering of those who love. Because that makes me think again of Terry Fox and how Terry Fox ran a marathon a day for more than 100 days. He was an extraordinary athlete in addition to bearing his trials in this noble way. But he actually considered the most inspirational day of his life to be a day he didn't run. He took the day off. And it was a day that he went swimming with a kid who had the same cancer and an amputated leg like he did. I always found that very moving because by his own account, it sounds like what gave Terry Fox the stamina for his marathon of hope was entering willingly into co-suffering with the others for whom he was dedicating his run all along. So, it's this fundamental condition that you share with your patients. It's your, in a certain sense, always also being patients yourselves. That is the source for your most important role as a doctor. This was Heschel's contention when he said that the mother of medicine is not human curiosity, but human compassion. So I think Abraham Joshua Heschel gives this really excellent prompt when he exhorted us at the start of his speech, though he took his topic up that he had been assigned, but he wanted us to not only remember that the patient is a person, but that every person is a patient. And we can detect right away the turnaround that turn of phrase achieves. How much more it demands of us. What maybe even it costs us. When we think of the patient as a person, that's good. It's better than not, that's for sure. But the important thing to remember is that every person is also a patient. We all suffer, we're all vulnerable, and insofar as we're all patients, we discover for ourselves and from the depths of our own need that the patient is the kind of being to whom the only adequate way to relate is this loving presence that conveys, I am with you. We, I think, stand nothing to lose and very much to gain by sustaining Heschel's certainly noble vision that the meeting between doctor and patient is a supreme occasion for being human. So I thank all of you for taking this opportunity to reflect on how all that you have suffered, in whatever form, in whatever manner, and faced, actually becomes and is becoming a basis and source of the moral energy for your creativity in care. Now we may have some Q&A.